If you see it today, you happen upon it, you just assume it's there for decorative purposes.
A cinder block wall with a few different names: the Wailing Wall, the Birwood Wall, the 8 Mile Wall. It's just south of 8 Mile Road, built by a real estate developer to separate people by race 80 years ago.
I thought about it a lot.
Tori May's been here 20 years.
Just makes you angry.
One Detroit partner, BridgeDetroit, teamed up with NBC News to tell the wall's story, which caught former Detroiter Johnnie Smith's eye. She's with her children visiting from California.
Actually, there was a write-up about the 8 Mile Wall, and I thought it'd be very interesting to have the kids come and see how Detroit was segregated not many years ago.
Detroit was growing really, really rapidly.
Aaron Einhorn and Olivia Lewis spent 6 months investigating the legacy of the wall. How did you get onto the story in the first place?
Yeah, actually, it was last summer, at the height of the protests, and George Floyd had been killed, and then there were all these other viral videos. And we were really struck by how differently people were viewing these events, like completely different lenses. You know, specifically white folks were viewing it very differently from Black folks. We were just kind of talking about, well, why is it? And it's actually pretty obvious why that is. You know, like here in one of the most diverse countries in the world, most Americans live in a segregated neighborhood.
In 1941, the developer had to keep his houses separate from an adjacent Black neighborhood to get a government loan. Up went a wall between Birwood and Mendota Streets, the embodiment of redlining, lending money but leaving out African Americans.
If you lived in that house.
More recently, Elizabeth Warren made a campaign stop here, and Gerald Van Dusen wrote a book about it.
You think most Detroiters even know about this wall?
Most people living on Mendota and Birwood don't know about the origins of the wall. That's what I found quite stunning. People were so used to, when they moved in, having this concrete backing, they assumed it was a lot like the kind of barriers you see maybe behind stores, you know, running maybe east and west on 8 Mile.
I knew about the wall. My mom had told me about the wall when I was younger because she grew up in a neighborhood close by.
My family also has ties to the neighborhood. My father grew up half a mile south of the wall. Some of the people we interviewed for the story were my father's, elementary school classmates. And this was actually, for me, a pretty revealing discovery. I think all of the white folks that we interviewed, none of them knew the wall was there when they were kids growing up.
There's been stories done about this wall before, but yours had some new information that probably was a revelation to a lot of people in Detroit.
I think one of the things that was really interesting about our story and what makes it a little bit different is that there is this ongoing story about one family.
The Cruz family came from Alabama in 1918 to the area near 8 Mile Road. It was Greenfield Township back then. They settled here in a tar paper shack.
We talk about a family who comes to Detroit, sets up their own neighborhood essentially, and is fighting for housing rights and access to housing early on. And then to see that play out over decades, I think is really important.
When we were getting started on this project, we were trying to figure out, well, okay, who built the wall? And we talked to experts and nobody seemed to know. And this was surprising because the wall's, as you said, gotten a lot of attention in recent years, but missing from that narrative has been who built the thing.
A dive into the archives revealed the developer, a prominent Detroiter from a prominent family, even today.
James T. McMillan and his two sons were the people who built the wall. James T. McMillan's grandfather was James McMillan, who represented Michigan in the United States Senate around the turn of the 20th century.
It's important to know who was behind things just so that we can go back and see how history played out. I think that people want to know not only who was responsible, but to hold people accountable and see how can we move forward and how have we moved forward. And so I don't think it's necessarily always a standpoint of blame, but how can we learn from this and do better in the future?
During the war, Detroit attracted more factory workers, causing a massive housing shortage. As the Birwood Wall went up, so too the Sojourner Truth Federal Housing Project, meant for African American war production workers on the northeast side. Trouble was, white people showed up when they tried to move in.
That particular incident, the riot, maybe even that is lost to history for a lot of people in Detroit.
Pretty much lost as well. It still stands. And I went over there one day fairly recently, and I was talking to the current manager of the public housing unit. They had no idea of the history of that structure and what had taken place during the war years.
Gerald Van Dusen wrote a book about the Sojourner Truth Riot, too. A riot instigated in part by a priest at a nearby Polish Catholic church.
And the arrests were primarily of blacks, even though whites were doing just as much of the pushing and pulling and rock throwing and the like.
As the country united against the Germans and Japanese, in Detroit, the arsenal of democracy, a fight was on to keep society segregated.
And the rule simply said this, that if you're going to put up housing, public housing, if the neighborhood is predominantly black, then the housing will be exclusively black. If it's predominantly white, it'll be exclusively white. If it's a mixed neighborhood, well, theoretically, it could be mixed, but never was it mixed. It was going to be one or the other, and typically it was in a mixed neighborhood, it was white.
Sojourner Truth became a rallying cry. A conflict over housing and race heard nationally.
The Birwood Wall incident, the Sojourner Truth incident, and then the hate strikes at the Packard plant and other factory plants really precipitated the race riot of 1943, the biggest riot of the war.
You know, I was driving recently down a broad boulevard that had a grassy median down the middle, right near the border of Detroit and Grosse Pointe, and thinking like, oh, I understand why this was here. A lot of those broad boulevards with grassy medians were built for the same exact reason this wall was built. We have all these legacies in all these different places, and we may not even know they're there.